Apa kabar? Saya nama Roger Bray. Dulu saya tinggal di negeri Malaysia. As you can probably tell from my very bad Malay, I once lived in Malaysia, but I don't speak Malay very fluently. And the idea of language and fluency is an idea that Jeff Vanderstelt picks up in his book called Gospel Fluency. And what he talks about is the idea that perhaps we could be more fluent in the gospel. And what he means is, are we the kind of people who speak the language of the gospel? In many ways, it's possible to become fluent to a certain extent in a language, but there's always more to learn. There's always more ways to think about a language, particularly when it's not your first language. Now, one of the implications of learning a new language is it starts to change the way you view the world. It starts to change the way that you interact with the world. So, if we become gospel fluent people, what happens is it starts to shape the way we go about relationships. So, for example, it would start to shape the way you relate to God. Your prayer life is shaped when you're more fluent in the gospel, because you start to pray about the things that are on God's heart. You begin to think about what is on God's heart, and you continue to pray about those kinds of things as you develop your prayer life. Of course, gospel fluency will also impact the way you tell your own story. I don't know about you, but I have stories in my head about who I am and how I act and what I want to be and what I want to do and where I'm going. And that story is very much impacted by the story of my life and what's taken place. But if I'm gospel fluent, then I start to see those events and those things that have happened around me in ways that suggest that it's part of the gospel story, that God actually has a story for me, and that He wants to shape my understanding of my own story in the context of what it means to be shaped by the gospel. Of course, gospel fluency also means that we have the opportunity to think about our conversations with one another. And that's perhaps one of the greatest impacts. How do I speak to you? How do I speak to my friends? How do I speak to my colleagues at work? How do I speak to those who are not believers in a gospelly fluent kind of way? Well, it's about learning a language. It's about learning the language of the gospel. And so what we're trying to do with this book and these videos is to start to explore together, what does it mean to be people who have a gospel fluency in our lives. In the next couple of videos, we'll be looking at some of the problems with gospel fluency. Then we'll look at some of the solutions. And then finally, I want to finish off with an example of where you can go away and start to think about how would you approach this situation if you were a gospelly fluent person. Thanks.